mid-1942, early summer. The P-38 Lightning was born of a desperate requirement, a fast-climbing, heavily armed bomber interceptor. It was a twin-tailed Dragon, designed for speed above all else. Lockheed's Hot Rod was immediately formidable on paper, yet its initial deployment revealed a cruel dichotomy. Pilots found themselves strapped into a machine lacking basic automation and comfort. They struggled with a poor power-to-weight ratio at higher altitudes where the air grew thin and cold. They learned quickly that skill was the only countermeasure against the machine's early shortcomings. They relied on inherent strengths: the counter-rotating props that eliminated torque, the aileron boost that granted incredible roll maneuverability, and above all, the firepower. 4 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns and 1 Oldsmobile-manufactured 20mm cannon were clustered tightly in the nose. This produced a devastating, concentrated circumference of fire, not much larger than a basketball. This weight of metal could, pilots claimed, penetrate the hull of a destroyer. When the throttles were slammed open, thick gouts of dark smoke would spew from the engines. This was a deceptive tactical advantage that often fooled pursuing enemy pilots into believing the aircraft was already crippled. The aircraft's baptism by fire came not over sun-drenched jungle. Instead, it was delivered in the desolate, freezing reaches of the North Pacific. Deployed in mid-1942 to the Aleutian Islands, the P-38Es of the 343rd Fighter Group and the 28th Composite Group found themselves engaged in a war fought against nature itself. The sheer scale of the landscape and the brutal, unpredictable weather were as lethal as any enemy Zero. Yet amid the fog and freezing rain, they achieved their first confirmed victories in August 1942, downing Japanese flying boats. The machine proved robust enough to survive the cold. Pilots like Captain George Laven demonstrated a daring confidence. Laven famously flew his Lightning all the way back to Texas just to visit family before returning to the grinding, isolated combat zone. As the Japanese expansion threatened Australia, the strategic focus shifted south. The P-38's long range made it indispensable in the vast Pacific theater, a fact General George Kenney recognized immediately upon taking command of the 5th Air Force in July 1942. Inheriting a force in disarray, Kenney was determined to use the Lightning to forge an effective fighting unit. By November 1942, P-38s were operating over Guadalcanal. The 339th Fighter Squadron of the 347th Fighter Group scored their first victories over Bougainville on November 18th. The aircraft's concentrated armament and high speed were beginning to dominate the tactical airspace. But the true test of the Lightning's range and strategic value arrived in the spring of 1943. It was delivered not by a combat report, but by a decoded radio message. Intercepted Japanese communications revealed the exact itinerary of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, scheduled to visit troops in the Northern Solomon Islands. Senior command in Washington recognized instantly that the P-38 was the only fighter in the USAAF arsenal capable of the required distance and speed for the interception. Operation Vengeance was a logistical nightmare and a pilot's gamble. Special 310-gallon drop tanks were rushed to Guadalcanal. The route was meticulously planned, 415 miles of low-level flight, designed to keep the 16 P-38s out of sight of Japanese observers. They had just enough fuel for the trip, about 15 minutes of loiter time over the target and the return flight. On the morning of April 18, 1943, Major John Mitchell, the 13th Air Force's first ace, led the strike force. They flew low, skimming the ocean swells. The roar of the engines was a constant, deafening presence. The target area was reached precisely on time. Below them, 2 G4M Betty bombers, carrying Yamamoto and his staff, and escorted by 6 A6M Zero Cents, were closing on the airfield. Mitchell's squadron, the designated killer section, including First Lieutenant Tom Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber, attacked from below the bombers. They caught the escort completely by surprise. Barber locked onto the second Betty. He closed the distance. The concentrated fire from his nose guns chewed into the bomber's structure. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The bomber exploded right in my face, Barber would recall, the concussion slamming his P-38, a piece of the disintegrating aircraft, a section of wing or fuselage, severed the intercooler on his left wing. Tracer fire, thick and orange, whipped past his cockpit as he kicked his rudders slipping and skidding to outrun the sudden swarm of pursuing Zeros. The mission was a success, though not without cost. The destruction of Yamamoto's bomber was confirmed. This was a strategic and morale victory of monumental proportions. First Lieutenant Ray Hine was seen descending, his engine smoking, having possibly accounted for a Zero before his loss. But the P-38 had proven its mettle under the most extreme pressure, demonstrating a range and interception prowess that no other fighter could match. By early 1944, the Lightning had become the most sought-after fighter in the USAAF. It now incorporated improvements like the J-25 model, capable of matching late Luftwaffe fighters up to 30,000 feet. It was the platform where approximately 100 of the eventual 175 P-38 aces scored their prerequisite 5 victories in the early, often criticized E-H models. Despite the initial struggles, the P-38 had decisively established the USAAF's dominance in tactical and strategic situations. Its potential was limited only by the daring of the men who flew it. The Japanese abandonment of Guadalcanal in February 1943 was a direct testament to the rising tide of Allied air superiority that the P-38 helped unleash. The arrival of the P-38 Lightning in the European and North African theatres following Operation Torch was less a triumphant debut and more a brutal trial by fire. The twin-boomed fighter, celebrated for its Pacific range, was instantly exposed to a seasoned and merciless Luftwaffe in North Africa. Early P-38 units sustained severe losses. The attrition rate was high, fueled by inexperienced pilots attempting to fight veteran German aces who knew how to exploit the Lightning's inherent weaknesses, such as weaving at extreme altitudes to force engine problems. Yet even in this chaos, the P-38 offered one immediate vital advantage: its unique silhouette. The unmistakable twin-boom design became an invaluable identifier for Allied ground troops. This was a stark contrast to the often confused identification between P-40s and enemy fighters, significantly reducing friendly fire incidents in the confusion of the Desert War. Despite the early setbacks, the machine's sheer speed, acceleration, and ability to climb quickly began to earn grudging respect. German pilots called this its impressive zoom climb. The P-38's long combat range was the strategic key, extending Allied reach deep over the Mediterranean. This capability proved decisive during Operation Flax in April 1943, when the Axis attempted a massive airlift to reinforce or evacuate troops from Tunisia. The sky over the Strait of Sicily became a shooting gallery. Flying low over the churning blue water, Flitoff Frank Hurlbut watched the sun glint off the metal skin of his Lightning. They were hunting the slow, heavy German transports, the Ju-52/3Ms, clogging the air lanes between Italy and Cap Bon. Suddenly the warning blared. 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, swift and deadly, were diving straight out of the sun. Hurlbut felt the familiar, sickening lurch of the P-38 as the enemy closed the distance. He saw the first flash of cannon fire below him, and the water surface erupted in geysers of white spray where the 20mm shells struck. They were at point-blank range, close enough to see the yellow noses and the faces of the pilots inside the cockpits. There was no time for textbook maneuvers. Instinctively, Hurlbut threw the P-38 into a desperate, cross-controlled skid. He banked violently, slamming the rudder in the opposite direction. The heavy fighter slewed sideways, defying all aerodynamics, sliding erratically through the sky. G-forces crushed him into his seat, his vision tunneling grey at the edges. The strange and unexpected maneuver caused all 4 pursuing German fighters to miss every incoming burst. The tracers that should have shredded his fuselage flew harmlessly past his canopy. As Hurlbut recovered, one Bf-109, perhaps overconfident or simply too fast, cut directly across his nose. It was a perfect, suicidal mistake. Hurlbut did not hesitate. He hammered the firing button, and the combined roar of the 4.5 calibers and the 20mm cannon shook the cockpit violently. The concentrated fire, a tight fist of devastation, ripped into the enemy fighter. The Messerschmitt spiraled instantly, already on fire, plunging into the sea below. Hurlbut's tactic, born of pure terror and quick thinking, had saved his life. The collective daring of the P-38 units during Flax resulted in a slaughter. Pilots claimed over 100 Axis aircraft destroyed, more than 70 of them lumbering Ju-52/3M transports. The Axis supply chain was severed, a victory forged entirely by the long reach and devastating firepower of the Lightning. Yet, as the Mediterranean campaign stabilized, the P-38 faced deep skepticism in its next destination, the China-Burma-India, or CBI, theater. Lieutenant General Claire Chennault, commanding the 23rd Fighter Group, harbored a decidedly negative initial impression. This bias was colored by a rigged demonstration where a souped-up, stripped-down P-40 had unfairly outmatched the Lightning. That bias, combined with the extreme operational difficulties of the CBI, meant the P-38 was initially viewed as less than ideal. The pilots who formed the Specialized Squadron X, later the 449th Fighter Squadron, were flying into a region defined by immense logistical difficulty and ruthless Japanese air power. They knew their aircraft was faster and climbed better than the P-40s they were replacing. But the Japanese Ki-44 Tojo was faster still in level flight. The stakes were impossibly high. On October 30, 1943, First Lieutenant Thomas D. Harmon, a former B-25 pilot who had transitioned to the P-38, took off in LITL Butch 2. His fighter bore the cartoon likeness of his wife, film star Elise Knox. The mission was reconnaissance, but the Japanese were waiting. As Harmon looked up and saw the 6 enemy fighters diving from above, the dread hit him with physical force. He screamed the realization into his radio, a sound immediately swallowed by the static. It was a trap. Before he could react fully, the machine guns opened up. The Japanese fighter had slipped in unseen behind him. Bullets tore into the cockpit, ripping through metal and equipment. Harmon felt an agonizing heat surge between his legs as the fuel primer exploded and fire erupted. The cockpit filled instantly with acrid smoke and the smell of burning oil. That was hit, his plane crippled, and fire consumed the space beneath him. There was no choice left. Harmon kicked the canopy open and rolled out into the cold rush of the slipstream. He pulled the ripcord, the parachute blooming above him, and he descended into the hostile jungle below. The sound of the dogfight faded, replaced now by the terrifying whine of approaching engines. As he neared the canopy, he made a conscious, terrifying decision. He slumped his body, playing dead under the protective silk of the parachute. The Japanese pilots, satisfied with their kill, circled once more and departed. Harmon landed hard, the jungle swallowing him instantly. He was alive, but he was alone, deep behind enemy lines. The fire and impact had left him injured, and the knowledge of the Axis mentality, which he knew Chennault hated, steeled his resolve. He began a harrowing, 32-day trek back to Allied lines, a testament to sheer, bloody resilience. The loss of 4 P-38s on that disastrous mission only intensified the criticism of the Lightning in the CBI.
But the tide was about to turn dramatically.
On Thanksgiving Day, November 24th through 25th, 1943, the P-38 finally proved its worth in a spectacular display of coordinated air power. 8 P-38Hs flew alongside 8 P-51As, escorting 14 B-25s to strike Shinju airfield.
The raid was devastating.
46 Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground. This success was a massive injection of morale, instantly overcoming the lingering skepticism. The P-38, now proven capable in the long, arduous missions required by the theater, had finally solidified its importance. It marked an ominous portent for the Japanese air forces in Burma and beyond. The American twin-tailed Dragon was no longer just a hot rod, it was a theater-defining weapon. The strategic shockwave of Operation Vengeance had barely dissipated when the war in the Southwest Pacific intensified. The conflict was pivoting entirely on the supply lines feeding the Japanese garrisons in New Guinea. Despite the newly established Allied air superiority, the Imperial Navy clung to a desperate strategy, reinforcing Leh by sea. This decision set the stage for the most decisive air-sea engagement of the early Pacific War, a battle where the P-38 Lightning, with its superior altitude performance and concentrated firepower, proved to be the executioner of Japanese logistics. The weather over the Huon Gulf in early March 1943 was miserable. Heavy cloud cover hung low, a dense grey umbrella that the Japanese transports attempted to slip under, hoping for furtive movement. But the P-38s were there, providing high-altitude protection for the massive Allied strike force of B-25s, B-17s, and Beaufighters. It was not the clean, high-altitude interception of Yamamoto's flight. This was a grinding, low-level war fought through turbulence and rain squalls. On March 3rd, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea reached its climax. 28 Lightnings were orbiting high above the convoy, ready to engage the swarm of defending Zero Cents and Oscars that materialized out of the cloud deck. The air filled with the deafening roar of high-speed passes. First Lieutenant Dick Bong, already establishing his reputation for fearless aggression, dove head-on into a formation of Oscars, his combat report later read, diving from the front, head-on, with about 30 degrees deflection. He made 2 passes the exact same way, a suicidal maneuver that paid immediate dividends. On the second pass, the enemy fighter began spinning down out of control, disappearing through a hole in the clouds toward the Huon Gulf. Below, the chaos was absolute. The Allied bombers, utilizing the deadly precision of skip bombing, turned the sea into an inferno. Ken Sparks, fighting through the thick of the melee, saw the immediate, visceral effect of the Lightning's guns. Sparks reported, "On our first pass, I knocked 1-0 off of Lieutenant Kish's tail." He continued, "He went down and out. I saw about a yard of orange-red flame shoot out from behind his cockpit. The destruction was so swift, so overwhelming, that in the span of a few seconds, Sparks watched 3 enemy fighters, his, Captain Farot's, and another, hit the water simultaneously as he pulled up to regain altitude." Captain Danny Roberts described meeting 30 Zeros at 18,000 feet. The ensuing dogfight was a blur of desperate maneuvers and tight turns. Roberts locked onto a Zero, firing a fine short burst the moment the enemy turned in front of him. He followed the spiraling aircraft all the way down, watching it splash into the sea. Moments later, he spotted 3 enemy planes flying beneath him. A sharp downward turn set him up perfectly for another kill. He fired a 2-second burst at a dive bomber flying at 5,500 feet. A section of the right wing instantly tore away. By the time the P-38s disengaged, the Japanese supply effort was utterly annihilated. Every single transport and its destroyer escorts had either been sunk or heavily damaged. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a decisive, grisly victory. It starkly demonstrated the profound vulnerability of Japanese supply lines to coordinated Allied air power. This victory marked a permanent shift in the strategic initiative. The Allies were now moving from defensive patrols to aggressive offensive strikes. The P-38 pilots, operating with supreme confidence, began to set records that defined a new era of air superiority. Nowhere was this mastery more evident than on June 16, 1943, near the Russell Islands. Desperately trying to regain the initiative lost at Guadalcanal, the Japanese launched a massive assault. It consisted of 24 Val dive bombers escorted by 74 Cents. Second Lieutenant Murray Shubin found himself flying directly into this maelstrom. The sky was suddenly choked with enemy aircraft, Zeros and Vals mingling like angry hornets. Shubin possessed a lethal proficiency with the P-38, despite his relative inexperience. He was outnumbered, facing a force superior in number and intent, yet he flew his Lightning into the thickest part of the engagement with utter fearlessness. Utilizing immense speed and concentrated nosefire, his P-38 became a wrecking ball. Shubin never engaged in prolonged turning fights. He relied entirely on the Lightning's acceleration and the devastating impact of his 20mm cannon. It dove, fired, and climbed away. The sight picture of enemy aircraft exploding filled his canopy again and again. In the ensuing chaos, the concentrated fire proved instantaneous. A tight burst into the cockpit of a Zero meant the aircraft would disintegrate, or erupt in flame and spin down into the sea below. Shubin pressed the attack relentlessly. He maneuvered his twin-tailed fighter with a precision that belied the aircraft's cumbersome reputation. He used the P-38's inherent strengths, forcing the enemy to react to his speed and heavy cannon fire. When the frantic, violent minutes of combat ended, the remaining Japanese forces withdrew. Shubin returned to base, the air still humming with adrenaline. His claims were staggering: 5 confirmed victories in a single sortie, with a 6th probable. He had met a superior force of enemy fighters and defeated them decisively. This was an extraordinary feat that underscored the Lightning's critical role in the Pacific. The P-38, once criticized for its teething problems, was now the premier instrument of Allied air power. Aces like Shubin, Bob Westbrook, and Bill Harris were emerging daily, their kill tallies climbing rapidly. The Japanese dominance of the Southwest Pacific Theater was irrevocably on the decline. The P-38 was not just a fighter, it was the physical symbol of the strategic shift. It enabled the relentless offensive that would soon lead to the neutralization of the formidable fortress of Rabaul. Spearheaded by the twin-tailed dragon, the Allies would henceforth remain on the offensive for the rest of the war. The crack 475th Fighter Group, the P-38-equipped Satan's Angels, arrived in the theater and immediately signaled a fundamental shift in the air war. Their deployment marked a substantial escalation of Allied offensive capability. They set victory records during the initial assault on Wewak in August 1943. The P-38s became the essential component in a deadly combination, escorting B-25s in devastating airfield strafing runs. This systematically dismantled Japanese infrastructure. The strategic objective was now perfectly clear. Rabaul, the colossal Japanese fortress, had to be neutralized. The gauntlet was thrown down in the skies over New Britain. The campaign pivoted from localized strikes to relentless, sustained pressure. These missions demanded immense range, pushing the P-38 and its pilots to their absolute physical limits. The air battles became a grinding war of attrition, culminating in massive, high-stakes bomber escort operations. On October 29, 1943, the sky above Rabaul was a cold, high-altitude world of thin air and unforgiving visibility. The B-24 heavy bombers, dark shapes lumbering through the frigid atmosphere, were the bait, though, below them, John O'Neill, flying his P-38 G-15 Beautiful Lass, led his squadron on high cover. The pilots were locked into their positions, the cold seeped through their flight suits, and the constant, mechanical roar of the twin Allisons vibrated through their bones. They knew the Japanese were watching. They were waiting. The alarm came suddenly, shattering the tense silence of the cockpit radio. O'Neill looked north and saw it, a terrifying, rising swarm of fighters arching in from the north. They were climbing fast to intercept the heavy bombers. The geometry of the attack was perfect. The P-38s had the altitude advantage they desperately craved. O'Neill slammed the stick forward, initiating a steep dive. The lightning instantly became a projectile. The speed built rapidly, the sound of the wind screaming past the canopy. He locked onto the lead Japanese fighter, a Zeke, as it pulled up to begin its attack run on the B-24 formation. O'Neill closed the distance, his crosshairs steady. The combined fire from the 450 calibers and the 20mm cannon converged into that tight, devastating circumference. As fist of metal traveling at 30,000 feet per minute, he fired a short burst. The enemy plane absorbed the impact, erupting instantly in a yard of orange-red flame before spiraling down, out of control. That was kill number 7. Moments later, he saw another fighter, a hap cut across his path, attempting to evade the dive of one of his wingmen. O'Neill kicked the rudder, adjusted his angle, and fired again. The cannon shells tore through the enemy's fuselage. The hap seemed to disintegrate mid-air, pieces flying off into the high wind. This interception, executed with ruthless precision, was near perfect. It severely disrupted the Japanese attempt to break the bomber formation. O'Neill returned to base with 2 more confirmed victories, numbers 7 and 8, achieved in a matter of desperate minutes, but the sheer violence of the campaign extracted a terrible human toll. The claims were high, and pilots like O'Neill, Major Porky Cragg, and Dick Bond waded into Japanese formations with utter fearlessness. Yet the reality was always a knife's edge away from disaster. The subsequent missions over Rabaul in early November, particularly Bloody Tuesday on November 2nd, saw the Allies lose 9 P-38s and 8 B-25s at Turno. This was a grim reminder that skill was no guarantee of survival. The strain of this combat was etched onto the faces of the men who flew. Ground crews noted the fierce expression Captain Charles King wore after every engagement. First Lieutenant Marion Kirby was so adrenalized during one dogfight that he held down his firing buttons until the gun barrels warped. The heat and friction had deformed the metal into useless curves. Major Charles MacDonald, who would eventually score 27 victories, felt the grim reality of air combat not in a triumphant kill, but in a sudden, sickening jolt. He had been hit. Return fire from a formation of dive bombers tore into his P-38. The controls went sloppy. The engine began to struggle. He was now utterly alone. facing the long, terrifying haul back to base. MacDonald had to nurse his damaged 433rd Fighter Squadron Lightning back to Dobodura, the twin engines strained, and a cockpit filled with the acrid smell of burning oil and ozone. Every mile was a gamble, a desperate calculation of distance and fuel. He finally reached the airfield perimeter, the fighter barely responding to his inputs before he was forced to crash land the crippled machine. He emerged from the canopy ashen-faced, alive but profoundly shaken. It was a testament both to the robust construction of the Lightning and to his own desperate skill. Other men vanished entirely into the jungle or the sea. The loss of veteran pilots, like Aleutian veteran Major Porky Cragg, killed in 1943, was constant and brutal. This theatre was unforgiving, demanding resilience even if a pilot managed to bail out. First Lieutenant Thomas D. Harmon symbolized this extreme danger when he had to abandon his burning P-38 over China. His ordeal involved 32 days of harrowing trek, alone in hostile territory, before he reached safety. While there were inherent uncertainties in aerial combat claims, the vagaries of observations from excited pilots often leading to discrepancies, the overall trend of the campaign was undeniable. The sustained Allied air pressure, enabled by the Lightning's capabilities, was devastating the Japanese. Between October 12th and November 11th, the Allies lost up to 22 P-38s over Rabaul, but the Japanese losses were exponentially higher. The sheer attrition rate, coupled with the relentless scoring ability of pilots like Bong and MacDonald, degraded Japanese air power past the point of recovery. By March of 1944, the Japanese were obliged to abandon Rabaul entirely. The P-38 had proven its value, forcing the enemy to develop a developing respect for the American fighter pilots. Air superiority was achieved. The twin-tailed Dragon had paved the way for the liberation of the Philippines and Southeast Asia. A new, urgent demand for long-range escort fighters in the European theatre of operations forced a massive shift. P-38 groups were redeployed from the relative warmth of the Mediterranean back to England in late 1943. This new theatre was defined by high altitude, extreme cold, and a Luftwaffe that was both experienced and unforgiving. The environment itself was hostile. Above 24,000 feet, the P-38's power-to-weight ratio deteriorated rapidly. The cold exacerbated initial problems with engine freezing and oil lubrication. The twin-tailed Dragon, a legend in the tropical Pacific, was suddenly fighting for its reputation in the vast grey skies over the European continent. The initial period in Europe was fraught with disaster. The 55th Fighter Group, arriving in October, faced a swift and brutal education in aerial combat over the Reich. Their first full-scale combat on November 13th, escorting B-17s to Bremen, proved to be a sober end to their introductory phase. The mission cost them 5 Lightnings. The fundamental problem was not the machine's potential. Its speed, range, and climb were fundamentally superior to the enemy. The failure lay in the application of flawed tactics dictated by commanders who failed to consult with the few pilots who truly understood the aircraft's unique envelope. The learning curve was steep, measured in lost friends and burning wreckage. But within the 55th Fighter Group, men like Captain Joe Myers and Second Lieutenant Jerry Brown were adapting. They were pushing the P-38 past its perceived limitations. The air was thin and bitingly cold at 26,000 feet. On one critical escort mission, Myers was flying high cover. He watched the massive silver boxes of the B-17 formation drone steadily toward their German target. He spotted a dark shape, a twin-engined Junkers 80-turn bomber approaching the formation, firing rockets that streaked through the sky before diving away. The greater threat materialized immediately afterward. Myers saw the sudden, frantic movements of his wingman, Lieutenant Brown. A Messerschmitt Bf-109, its cowling a flash of yellow, was glued to Brown's tail. Myers' heart hammered against his ribs as he yelled the evasive warning over the radio. But the German pilot was a master of the dogfight. Brown threw his P-38 into a desperate sequence of maneuvers, performing violent evasive action with dives, zooms, skids, and rolls. Yet, the 109 persisted, refusing to break off. Myers slammed his throttles forward, closing the distance, using the tremendous acceleration of the Lightning. He fired deflection shots, but the range was still too great. He watched, horrified, as the German fighter found its mark. Cannon shells ripped into Brown's right engine. Instantly, a column of thick brown smoke poured out from the nacelle. Brown fought the controls, feathering the damaged engine, but the 109 was still there, closing in for the kill. Myers knew he had only seconds left. He could not line up a conventional shot because the 109 was too close to his wingman. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Myers inverted his P-38, rolling onto his back. Hanging upside down in his straps, fighting the immense G-forces, he closed to within 150 yards of the German fighter. He fired a continuous 5-second burst, the concentrated nose fire roaring out in a devastating stream. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. The German engine burst into flame, and pieces of shredded aluminum and black debris flew violently across the sky. Myers passed within 40 or 50 feet of the burning Messerschmitt, close enough to feel the heat and smell the acrid burning fuel. The 109 spiraled away, a pillar of fire plunging toward the clouds below. Brown, engine dead but miraculously alive, limped his heavily damaged fighter back to base. Myers had not only saved his wingman, he had demonstrated the aggressive close-quarters fighting the P-38 desperately needed to survive in the ETO. This was the painful, necessary adaptation. The P-38 was not a forgiving dogfighter like the Spitfire, but it was a devastating weapon when its unique characteristics were ruthlessly exploited. New tactics emerged quickly. Pilots learned to use the Lightning's superior climbing turn to gain positional advantage and master the aircraft's extreme high-speed envelope. First Lieutenant Lyndall Graham was one of the pilots who perfected this new mastery. He understood that the P-38, especially the newer J models with their hydraulic aileron boost, could handle maneuvers that would tear the wings off lesser planes. During one engagement, Graham sighted a Focke-Wulf 190. He initiated a steep high-speed dive to intercept. Of the 190 was fast, but Graham was decisively faster. As he closed, the air pressure built, shaking the cockpit violently. Graham was approaching speeds over 375 miles per hour, a velocity where most fighter pilots would never risk deploying flaps. But Graham knew the trick. He deployed his combat flaps. The Lightning, instead of tearing itself apart, responded with a controlled, astonishingly tight pullout from the dive. This gave him the perfect firing angle. He approached the enemy fighter from a 45-degree angle, the Focke-Wulf filling his gun sights. He opened fire with all 4 50-caliber machine guns. The tracers arced forward, hitting the Focke-Wulf 190's right wing. The German fighter immediately snapped into a violent, uncontrolled spin and disappeared into the thick overcast below. Specialized tactics, combined with the arrival of improved models, gradually redeemed the Lightning's reputation. The P-38 J-25, featuring power-assisted ailerons and crucial dive brakes, finally gave pilots the technological edge they needed. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force had been plagued by catastrophic bomber losses. Once the P-38 resumed full operations, those losses began to stabilize dramatically. It was now clear the initial perceived shortcomings were not fundamental design flaws. They were, instead, tactical failures that had since been corrected and mastered. The sheer range of the Lightning was indispensable. It had the unique ability to carry the fight deep into German territory, far past where single-engine fighters ran out of fuel. The twin-tailed fighter, once scorned and dismissed in the ETO, had secured its place. Focke said, triumph was due entirely to the resilience and skill of its pilots. By enabling that necessary long-range escort, the P-38 contributed immeasurably to achieving air superiority. This dominance was the essential precursor to the Normandy landings. It paved the way for the final, decisive phase of the war. The Lightning was finally on the threshold of its greatest period of fame. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.